For years, the New Hampshire Secretary of State's office has been fighting a battle to preserve trust in the state's elections. And it's a unique struggle because time and again, they've conducted exhaustive investigations for any signs of fraud. And they found the usual individual cases, but zero evidence of anything more widespread or nefarious. Nonetheless, that all-important trust in the system has continued to erode anyway, and that trend has accelerated since the 2020 election. The latest idea is the possibility of rapid auditing, checking the vote in select locations immediately after it's been counted. Here this morning to discuss that and more is Deputy Secretary of State David Scanlon. Thank you for joining us, Deputy Secretary.
Good morning.
So how would this concept of a rapid audit work in practice? Would this be almost like a strike team dropping in on random towns and cities after the votes are counted?
There's been a lot of concerns raised about. There have been a lot of concerns that have been raised recently, certainly after the 2020 general election, about how accurate the voting machines are that we use in New Hampshire. New Hampshire, over the years, has conducted many recounts, far more recounts than any other state in the country. And regularly, those recounts show that the machines count accurately. Where there are problems with the machine counts is that there is usually a human factor that is identified as at least part of the cause. But the people's confidence in those devices and in elections generally, whether it's in New Hampshire or around the country, has been tarnished. And it is important that our citizens and our voters have faith and confidence that the results that we produce after an election are accurate. So there has been talk among legislators about, what can we do to audit or confirm after the fact, after the election is over, that the results are in fact accurate and that the machines have counted the ballots properly. There are a number of ideas that are being tossed around in terms of how best to audit an election. Certainly something that takes place shortly after an election that allows candidates an opportunity to request a recount if something suspicious is found is beneficial. There are logistical issues that go along with that, though, given the tight timeframes that we are on to report results, have them certified, give candidates an opportunity to request a recount, and then get ballots printed for the next election if it's in the case of a primary, or have the winners of elections certified so that they can take their seats in early December on Organization Day. These are all important discussions. We are very interested in having them, but it's going to be a partnership between our office, candidates, and what the public wants to see in terms of what an audit might look like. And, it is difficult to say at the moment what that will look like, but after a good solid discussion in the legislature, I think that might become more clear.
So much needs to be fleshed out, but would you need different machines to carry out these audits? And if so, how much would they cost?
Well, there are different ways to conduct an audit. The simplest way is that you identify the towns or the machines that are going to be audited, and you can do a hand count of those. There are high-speed scanning devices that have the ability to count large numbers of ballots in a short period of time. That would allow for a larger a selection of ballots that could be reviewed in an audit. But again, we're using a machine to do that. So, if that is the decision of the legislature, then it would be important that we use a different machine than the machines that obviously count the ballots, and preferably a different vendor, a company that would be responsible for the programming of that machine as opposed to the one that is used program the machines are used in the election.
We've seen around the country in other audit or investigation situations that in some cases, when no evidence of fraud or malfeasance is found, there are some people who want the investigation or audit to continue until something is found. How important is it for this audit team to be able to complete its work completely and decisively and quickly, and not just for the statutory reasons you mentioned in terms of having to have things done by that Friday to get a recount going, but more on the confidence side?
Yeah, and that is the hurdle that I think we have to face, is that number one, we have to make sure that the voters are confident that the results of our election were accurate. But at the same time, we have to be able to complete that task and end it so that the legislators that have been elected can take their seats. There is an important aspect of elections, and that is at some point, there has to be finality. The results that are determined are the results, and we live with that until the next election when we have a new election. In New Hampshire, for state offices and county offices, well, for state offices, it's every 2 years we elect an entirely new state government. And so that's the longest that people have to wait to be able to change their mind if they want to. Congress, 2-year terms, Senate, of course, are 6-year terms.
Obviously, the audit that you guys had in Windham was very closely watched, unprecedented, very interesting to those of us who like to pay close attention to this stuff. But to the impartial observer, it appeared to be a complete and definitive and totally transparent process. But among some of the people who really wanted there to find something there, some kind of fraud, there was a refusal to accept results. The goalposts kept moving for people. I saw you dealing with individuals there, and the Secretary of State as well, who just really wanted to find something that wasn't there. So how do you proceed in those situations when you provide people the facts and they don't want to believe them?
Well, we have to keep doing our best to make sure that everything that we do is transparent, and that the facts are the facts, and that they are readily displayed and made public. That's the way you provide confidence to elections, is that there are no secrets. That's one of the difficulties with machines, however, is that because they count and they use a software program to do that, and there is a memory card that, in the case of the AccuVote devices, that are programmed to be able to count every single ballot in New Hampshire, that's not a visible process. Even though the processes on either side of that, we believe, are transparent. There are individuals that just have a healthy skepticism of the devices and the process. It's those individuals that certainly help set the parameters of the discussions that we have on how do we instill confidence in the election. So we just have to do the best job that we can in transparency and making facts and results available. The individuals that simply don't want to believe those results or want it done a different way, they can keep trying, and I believe that's a healthy exercise.
This is a little philosophical here, but at what point, just in continuing to search for fraud, widespread fraud that has continued to be non-existent and can't be found, are you just playing into the narrative that elections can't be trusted?
Well, again, there's a national narrative that is heavily at play in New Hampshire, and there are states in the country that have had their issues with conducting elections in a manner that that give confidence in the results. And what happens nationally, certainly affects us here in New Hampshire. As the Secretary of State and I have stated regularly over the years, is that while there are isolated events of improper voting in New Hampshire, and those events, those situations, when they have been discovered, have been prosecuted by the Attorney General's office, we have seen no evidence of widespread or organized fraud in this state. And if somebody were to bring that information forward to us, there would most certainly be a follow-up.
What are the consequences, though, for the work you do in the sanctity of elections when you have this unprecedented situation in which former President Donald Trump continues to allege that it was fraud nationwide, not just nationwide, but specifically in New Hampshire?
Well, again, the former president has his opinion on what transpired here. Certainly, we have not seen the facts or the evidence to back up those claims. He's entitled to believe what he believes. It certainly doesn't make our job any easier in convincing the public that they should have confidence in the way we run elections in New Hampshire, even though all the evidence that we have shows that we run elections really well here and that people can rely on the results.
Okay, Deputy Secretary of State David Scanlon, we appreciate your time on Close Up.
Thank you.
All right, and that wraps up this edition of Close Up New Hampshire. Thanks for watching. Have a great Sunday.